I've just noticed we've got a comment in the chat saying good morning from J9. So I wonder where J9 is coming from. Perhaps not Wales. So you can all post hello in the chat. Tell us where you're coming from. That might be quite interesting. Oh, we got someone from Washington. There we are. So you can post your questions in chat as well as we go through, and I'll answer them at the end. So for those of you who attended last week, it's the same format. I'm going to go through a PowerPoint. Got not so many slides this time, so there'll be a bit more time for questions and answers at the end. So yes, welcome. And I'm going to share my screen now and just start on the PowerPoint. Okay, can everyone see that? Yeah, good. Oh, hang on, where's it going? Okay, so I was asked to talk to you about early crops and what to sow now. Now, what to sow now is a really big question because it really depends on where you live and what's your climate. So I'm going to go through it a bit, but you have to really know where you live. So I'm going to cover seed choice very briefly. We mentioned seeds a bit last week. How to maximize your sowing success, and how to extend the season by getting these early crops in now. So the first thing to think about is what to grow. And we talked about crop rotation last time, and we talked about making your cropping plans and knowing your plant families. So for those of you who did attend last week, maybe you've had a bit of time this week to write some lists of what you want to grow and think about the plant families. But today we really need to think about the soil and the site and the weather. So the first thing to think about is, when is your last frost? And if you don't know that, just ask other people that do gardening. Now, normally I'd say, join your local gardening club, go to the local farmers market. It's a good thing as well, and speak to the local growers there. They'll be able to tell you when the last frost is. Oh, sorry, it keeps jumping about. So for me, our last frost in spring can be as late as the beginning of June, which makes it very hard to get tender plants planted out, like squashes and things. I'm planting much later than growers that are based in Machunkleth because they're closer to the sea and they're milder than I am. So that last frost date is very important. And a lot of things that we want to plant early, we're counting back the weeks from the last frost date. So if it's going to take a week or two for a seed to germinate and then another couple of weeks for it to grow on, we could be looking at 3-4 weeks before the last frost date for when we want to actually sow our seeds. So that date is very important. The next thing to think about is know the land where you're actually growing and know if you've got any frost pockets. So it's a really good time of year to look for frost pockets at the moment, because frost pockets are areas of land that stay frozen during the day and don't thaw because the sun's never getting to them, or areas that frost when other areas don't. And that's because the effect of frost rolling down the hill and then getting blocked by a hedge or a building or something like that. So, you have to get up early in the morning and look for those frost pockets, because there's no point in planting or sowing your early crops in frost pockets, because they're going to be cold, the soil will be cold, and they won't thrive. The other thing we talked about briefly last week was doing a soil test. So you need to know your garden soil. And many of us in Wales have a very heavy clay soil, which is made up of very small particles, and it doesn't free drain very well, which means it holds water, and that makes it very slow to warm up in springtime. So if we want to be cultivating the land and getting plants out in the open ground early, the clay soil isn't helpful. But there are ways that we can get around that by, say, covering the soil up. We can, if you cover it up with something that's dark, like some woven black plastic, that absorbs the heat, and it will dry the soil up and heat it up quicker. We could also be adding sand to the soil to open it up and make it more free draining. The next thing we want to think about is our seed choice and thinking about pests and disease. And again, I mentioned last week, prevention is better than cure. So we need to be thinking about our pests and disease now before we even start sowing any seeds. So we're looking for resistant varieties, and we're thinking about planting multiple varieties to suit different conditions, so we get a more resilient system. So with seeds, the best thing to do is order them early, before Christmas, ideally. And then that way you ensure the availability of the seeds that you want. And after last year's panic growing and loads of people coming new to growing, the seed companies were really rushed off their feet last year, and the same thing's happening again this spring. So they are getting very short of certain varieties. So it's every year it's worth getting your order in early. You might want to think about buying organic seed, because then you're supporting the whole organic industry. And although the seed is very small and the amount of chemical that then goes on into your plant is minuscule, by buying organic seed, you're supporting organic. So if you believe in organic, then, support the seeds as well, seed industry as well. You can reduce the cost of buying your seeds by buying in bulk. Seeds, if they're kept properly, that's cool and dark, they will last for years. The exception to that is parsnips. They only last for 1 year, but most seeds, brassicas, peas and beans, they'll last for 5 years, no problem, as long as they're kept well. So you can buy, bigger packets to bring the price down and divide the cost over several years, or you can buy together with a group, from the gardening club or just your neighbour or friend, so that you can share one packet of seeds. Think about buying local. We've got the Real Seed Company in Wales that grow open pollinated seeds that are suitable for Welsh climate. We've got Sharpo potatoes that were bred in Wales for Welsh climate, and they're very blight resistant. And think about saving your seed. You might not have space to save your own seed if you've only got a small garden, but you can still attend seed swaps and pick up seeds that way. So we've got our seeds, we've chosen what we want to grow, we know what our rotation is and when we're going to put them in, and we know what our soil is. So we're now going to come on to actually getting down to the business of sowing some seeds. So you need to know, firstly, what your seeds need, what the plants need. And at this time of year, the main thing we need to know is, are they hardy or not? Now, hardy means that they're probably native to this country and they're tolerant of our weather, our cold, our frost, and they're hardy and they can be grown at this time of year. You also need to know what the seeds need to germinate, because just because a plant is hardy doesn't mean that the seeds will germinate when it's that cold. Some will and some won't. And many seeds that you're itching to grow at the moment are not hardy and need high temperatures to germinate. And we'll look at that in more detail in a bit. Compost. So there's lots of composts on the market. We should all be thinking about buying peat-free compost because it's a sustainable product. We want to be careful of the terminology organic, because organic is a regulated word when it comes to food crops, but when it comes to plants and compost, it's not a regulated word, which means bags of compost can write organic on it, and it isn't actually certified organic. It is the true meaning of the word organic, which means it was once alive. It's a carbon-based product that was once alive. So peat-based compost can be called organic because it is an organic product that was once alive. So reading the label organic isn't an indicator of whether it's sustainable compost. You want to be looking for peat-free compost. And the sort of products that are in a peat-free organic based compost would be coir, which comes from coconut husks, wool, bracken, municipal green waste. And these are all sustainable sources. Then the next thing is the seed trays or modules. So most new growers will grow in a seed tray, and you've all seen them. They're about the size of an A4 piece of paper, and you can sow a lot of seeds in there very, very quick. But the problem with that is you then have to thin them out or prick them out and plant them on into bigger pots. So a better option might be to sow into modules, and these pictures you can see at the bottom here are modules. So you get multiple cells within a tray, and the idea is that you plant one or clusters of seeds per module, depending on which seed, what it is you're growing. And then you can, once they've germinated and you've got little baby plants there, you can pick out the whole module and pot it on. So potting on is much, much quicker from modules, but sowing the seeds is slower. But overall, you gain lots of time by doing it in a module. And there's lots of advantages in that the seeds are better spread out, you get better air circulation, and you're a lot less likely to get damping off disease. The other picture I've got there on the right hand side, sorry, I'm just going to move you all, you're half over my screen. So the other picture on the right hand side is root cells, and these rooting modules are good for deep rooted plants like beans and peas because they force the roots to go down deep. And then you can open the cells up and you can pick the module out, so you get no root disturbance when you pot them on or plant them into the ground. So they're very good. They are expensive investment to start with, but you can reuse them year on year. And the other picture that I've got there is a seed sowing machine. If you've got quite a big garden and you're doing a lot of growing, it might be worth investing in one of these because it just makes sowing seeds faster. You set up the hole to fit the size of the seed that you're sowing, so you use a bigger hole for the bigger seeds, and it's much better on your back, so you're not having to bend over sowing seeds. You just stand up, it's as fast as walking, it rolls along behind you and drops the seeds at the right distance. So they're quite good for speeding things up. So I would just say, normally I'd do a demonstration at this point, but I'm sitting in my car, so it's not possible. But when you fill your seed tray or module with compost, it's best to just fill the compost in there gently. Don't push it down hard with your fingers. It's a mistake I see all new growers doing is they firm the compost in. But of course, compost and soil is 25% air, and you need those air gaps so that there's spaces for the roots to get into the soil. So what you do is just gently fill the trays up with compost and then water the tray. And when you water it, the compost settles into the tray. And then if some of the modules or part of the tray isn't filled completely, you can top it up with a bit more compost. And it's always better to water the seed tray first before sowing the seeds, because if you water it once you've sown the seeds can get pushed down too far deep into the compost, or they can get washed off the seed tray altogether. And then once you've sown your seeds, you often need to cover them, but some seeds like lettuce, they need the light to germinate, so you don't want to cover them with much. And as a general rule, the bigger the seed, the more compost goes on top of it. So tiny seeds are generally really close to the surface, and you can cover them with some compost. You might want to sieve the compost with a riddle just so it goes on lightly, or you can use a product called vermiculite, and this is very lightweight. It comes from expanded silica. It's very lightweight, so it doesn't weigh the seeds down, and it holds moisture and heat, so it can help speed up the germination. So we're now going to think about how we can extend the season and get these early crops in. So we want to, if we're thinking about self-sufficiency or feeding ourselves, or trying to save some money, we can push the boundary by getting these early crops in, and again late crops at the end of the season, the main season. And these crops, sometimes we're having to take a little bit of a gamble on when that last frost is. We're having to work a little bit harder to protect them, but they return. The return is that we get early crops when things are not available in the shops or they're expensive. And then we've got crops that we can repeat sowing again and again right the way through the growing season, like salad, leafy veg, beetroot, carrots, beans and peas. And that way we can have a crop from them from late May right the way through until maybe November, December. So where are we going to sow? There's 3 types of plants that we can be growing at this time of year. We've got the hardy early crops that can be sown directly outside. Now, we might not have been sowing them last week when it was -5 and the ground was rock hard, but as we get to the end of February, we can sow them directly outside. Then we've got hardy crops that could be grown outside but really benefit from a bit more protection. And that's because they get battered about by the wind and the rain and the frost. They will grow, they will survive, but they'll get a bit tattered and not look so nice. And the leaves are a bit harder as well and not so tender. So things like salad crops benefit from a bit of protection. And then the third group is the tender crops, which need warmth and light. And it is definitely not even worth starting these at this point unless you've got the equipment and the space to do so. So even though I'm a commercial grower, I do not start my tender crops in February because I can't give them the space and the light that they need to take them through till the frost-free period. And that's the thing with the tender crops. You've got to keep them warm and give them enough light right up to the point where it's warm enough to plant them out. So let's look at those bit by bit now. So the first one, and probably the easiest, is the hardy early crops that we can sow out now. And that would be things like broad beans and hardy peas and onion seeds. And that's onion seeds, not sets. Sets go in later. So let's look at those individually. So broad beans are hardy down to -10. You can actually plant them in October and November and they'll overwinter, and you can have them in the polytunnel or directly sown outside in October, November, and they overwinter at about 15 centimeters high. If you plant them too early, they put on too much growth in the autumn, and then they will get knocked back by the weather and the wind. So you want them short over winter. And they will give us a crop at the end of May. But if we plant them now, they catch up with those ones planted in autumn, and they'll give you a crop 2 weeks later. So if you've got enough space, you can do an autumn crop and a spring crop, and then you can do another crop in March and April, and each one comes a couple of weeks after the other one, and that gives you a continuous supply. But also the advantage of broad beans, many people don't want the broad beans in the summer once they've got other vegetable available, and you can have French beans and runner beans, which are tender. So it's quite a good thing to plant the broad beans either overwintering or early now at the end of February, and they give you an early crop when the other beans wouldn't. You can't plant them and you can't get crop from them. So that's extending the season then. They only need 2 degrees to germinate. So they're going to germinate now, whether you have them in a greenhouse or polytunnel or outside, unless the ground's completely rock solid, frozen like it was last week. And the soil, they need rich and moisture retentive. And that's the same for all peas and beans. We talked last week about them being nitrogen fixing, so they will grow quite happily in nutrient deficient soil. But they need organic matter in the soil to retain the moisture so that the pods can swell. So it's worth either mucking or composting or mulching your legume beds to retain that moisture. The most important thing with the beans is to protect them from strong wind, so they can cope with the frozen soil, they can cope with the heavy rains and waterlogged soil, but what they won't like is the strong winds. And what the strong winds doing, apart as well as buffering them around and making them grow sideways, it's taking the moisture from the leaves. And a lot of the plants this week with me, because the ground's been frozen all week and it was windy, the plants are wilted because they couldn't take up any moisture because the soil was frozen. And it'll be the same with any of your winter crops. That's what, if they're in a windy site, they're losing moisture out the leaves. So you could put a windbreak up or get some hedges planted around your garden. Broad beans will support each other. They've got big, thick, chunky stems, so you don't need to give them any extra support. But what you do is you plant a block of broad beans, so a minimum of 2 rows. You can plant 3 or 4 rows, and each plant is 20 centimeters apart, and they all hold each other up. And then the varieties that are winter hardy, they're all quite winter hardy, but Aqua Dulce Claudia is the most hardy for autumn sowing. Whitcomb Manita, I have planted in autumn, but it's the main one I plant in spring. I think it's sweeter than the Aqua Dulce. And then we've got the Hang Down, which is one that Real Seeds recommend for good hardiness. And the thing with broad beans is to pick them when they're young and eat them small. You can eat the whole pod before the beans develop. I don't particularly like them like that. They're a bit like eating a furry blanket. But I do recommend you pick them when the beans are still small in the pod. As they get bigger, they get tougher, and they're not so nice to eat. So but if you've done your crop planning and you've got your rotation sorted out and you're trying to get an early crop of beans in before your main crop of vegetables goes in that bed, and you find that you're running out of space and you need to get your next crop in that bed, you can pick the beans before they've developed. You can pick pods, sorry, before they've developed beans, and then you've had a crop, you've had a harvest, you've had something to eat, you can get them out and then get your next crop in. And then we're moving on to peas. Again, they're in the leguminous family. They can fix their own nitrogen. And there's 2 main types of peas. There's the round peas and the wrinkled peas. The round peas are the winter hardy ones. The wrinkled peas are the summer varieties. And as a general rule, the round peas are generally shorter, so they're better to withstand the winter winds and weather. And And the wrinkled peas, because they're wrinkled, they hold a lot of water in their wrinkled peas before they've swollen and germinated. So they can actually rot before they've germinated. So it's the round peas for hardiness. And like the broad beans, we can plant them in the autumn and they can overwinter, or we can be planting them now for a very early crop. And they'll be ready in about 11 to 13 weeks. So if you know that, you can then plan from your sowing day when you're going to have a harvest, and then you know when you can get your next plant in to follow on. So the trick of planting anything now at this time of year is to try and warm the soil up first. And ideally you would cover it with something for a week or two before you start sowing directly into the soil. And it might be that you've got an old piece of carpet. You could use cardboard and weigh the cardboard down with something. What I use is a woven geotextile plastic fabric, which allows water through, but it's black, so it absorbs heat and warms the soil up, and it suppresses weeds. So I use that a lot for covering beds, just to keep on top of the weeds. So if you covered up the soil tomorrow and start warming the soil up, you'd be ready to plant in a week or two once it's warmed up. And you can either sow the seeds direct by drawing a trench about 15 centimeters wide, and I use a big draw hoe for this, and then you scatter the seeds along the trench, aiming at sowing the seeds 7.5 centimeters apart. So you can either scatter them if you're very good at that and not oversow them, or you can place them out in a sort of diagonal, or like a 5 on a dice, so that you've got sort of 3 rows 7.5 centimeters apart in the trench. It's very easy to oversow your peas if you're scattering them. And the downside of this is that you then get over congested plants when they grow, and then there's no airflow, so you're more likely to get mildew and fungus growth. So good spacing is correct. The other alternative is you can start them off in modules to transplant. And one way of doing that is getting an old piece of gutter, and you sow them in the gutter, and once they've grown and germinated, you can then just slide the whole lot out into a trench into the open ground. So if you wanted to get started early now, you would cover up your soil tomorrow, you'd sow some peas in your greenhouse, conservatory, kitchen windowsill, wherever. And then once the soil's warmed up in a couple of weeks and your plants have germinated, you could transplant them. The downside of transplanting them is it takes much longer and more resources to sow them in pots and then transplant them than it does to sow them direct. The downside of sowing them direct, it's quicker and easier, and you often get a better result, but you do need to protect them from mice, especially at this time of year. The autumn sowing in October, November, there's loads of things for mice to eat, and so they generally germinate without any problem. But by the time we get to February, mice are starting to get hungry, and they will find those peas, and often you're still waiting for them to germinate, and you haven't even seen that they've been up and the mice have had them overnight. So you do need to think about how you're going to protect them. Even if you're growing them in a greenhouse or polytunnel, you still need to protect from mice. So hardy pea varieties. Meteor is one of the main ones that I grow, and mainly I grow it because it's a very short plant, so I don't have to use any pea sticks to support it. It's only 45 centimeters, and it's very hardy, so I can sow this in the autumn. It overwinters, it's short stems, and no staking, but it produces small pods. The peas are still good size within the pod, but the pods are quite small, but very sweet and tasty. Another good one that I use for the spring sowing for now is Dulce Provence, which is a much taller plant, 75 centimeters high. So this will need some support, and there's lots of different ways of supporting your peas. I find the best way is to use like birch branches, and birch trees sort of shed their branches all the time, so they're easy just to pick up and use them. But don't cut your silver birch in March or April because the sap's rising and they keep bleeding. But you can use any sticks. You only just need some little light sticks to put in, but put them in shortly after germination, or you can put them in when you plant the seeds or sow the seeds. But once they're in place, it's harder to hoe and weed around them. So I tend to put them in just after the plants germinate. And then they've got tendrils on the pea shoots, and so they'll climb up any support that you give them. Another good early variety is Kelvedon Wonder. This can also be used as a main crop, so it's a dual purpose one if you only wanted to buy one packet of seeds. So that's our peas, and peas are really, really tasty. And although it can take a long time to harvest your peas and then pod them, and then you only get a tiny small bowl of peas, there is nothing like the taste of fresh peas from the pod straight from the garden. There's no need to take them into your kitchen and cook them. Just eat them fresh. Delicious. And then the last plant that's hardy to sow now is onion seed. Now, most people grow onions from sets, and sets are just immature onions. So they've been grown from seed, they've been grown on as sets, and then they're dug up, dried out a little bit, and then sold to you. And it speeds everything up. Whereas sowing by seed, the earlier you get them started, the better result you're going to get. So we're getting a little bit late to sow onion seeds now. The show growers, they always start them just before Christmas. Most people, I think, would be starting them in January. So you want an early start for your onion seeds. If you're going to sow them in seed trays, you want a very good compost, and you need to feed them regularly because they've got to bulk up quickly to produce the onion sets in 1 year. Another way of doing it is directly into a seed bed. So that's a well-prepared bed of soil in the open ground that you know is weed-free. So you've hoed it loads of times, you've weeded it, it's weed-free. And then you sow rows 20 centimetres apart and scatter the seeds along that. And then you thin them firstly to 5 centimetres apart, and then you do a second thinning to 10 centimetres apart, that's 4 inches, and then let them grow on to be onions in their final place. And the advantage of putting them in a seed bed is that they can access all the nutrients they need from that, whereas if you're sowing them in a pot or modules, they run out of nutrients very quickly in the compost. If you want to plant onions from set, we don't do that until end of March, April, when the soil's warmed up. So the next group of plants we're going to look at are the hardy crops that could be sown outside now, especially if you live somewhere mild, but they really benefit from a bit of protection. So that's things like lettuce and oriental leaves, like rocket. So those leaves, they will germinate outside. They germinate in cool temperatures below 10 degrees, so it's perfect. But the weather is so harsh, it's very strong winds, sideways rain, and they get battered and the leaves get damaged, and slugs love them. And so in the wet conditions at the moment, get a lot of slug damage. And then we've got beetroot and carrot. So we'll look at each of those now. So the salads and leafy crops, we've got lettuce, corn salad, purslane, or you might know it as claytonia or miner's lettuce. It's all the same thing. And then we've got our oriental leaves, the brassica leaves, rocket, mustard green, mizuna, mabuna, tak choi, pak choi, all very hardy leaves. And then we've got spinach, Chards and beets, we can be growing beetroot as a salad leaf, baby kale as a salad leaf. Now, all of these prefer cooler temperature, and they will germinate at around 4 degrees. So no problem with germination outside at the moment. So I'm just going to go back through that list now. So if I was sowing lettuce now, I would be looking at the hardier varieties like winter crop or something like that. Although saying that, I've grown all types of lettuce at this time of year and found that they've germinated fine. The oriental leaves, the advantage of growing them now or over winter, I mean, you could again grow these in autumn and they'll overwinter in a polytunnel or greenhouse quite successfully. But the advantage of sowing them early is, firstly, they really like the cool temperatures. And if you try growing them in summer, they'll bolt very quickly. And bolting means they go to seed. So what happens is they start by sending up a shoot, and then that shoot produces flowers and seed, and then they go bitter. So they don't taste so nice. And they'll do that very quickly if they're overcrowded, planted too close, or if the temperature gets hot and they're not getting enough water. But the other thing that affects oriental leaves, particularly in summer, is the flea beetle. And flea beetle will affect all brassicas, but most brassicas, we're not eating the leaves. So the plant just outgrows the flea beetle and it doesn't really affect it. But with these leafy crops, brassica crops that we're wanting to eat the leaves, what they do is they put little shot holes all over the leaves, tiny little round holes, and you just land up with a lattice of leaf that doesn't look very appetizing. So if we grow them now and then we've got them harvested and eaten before the flea beetle's about and before the hot weather's about for them to bolt. Spinach, it will germinate at about 4 degrees. It's a cool climate thing. It likes shade. So you can be planting it now, sowing it now, and you can eat it as a salad, as baby leaves, or you can let it get big and have big salad spinach leaves. Same with chard. You can be putting baby leaves of chard into your salad. It gives a nice color. There's all sorts of different colors of chard, rainbow chard. There's a lovely orange one that I like growing, can't remember the name of it. And beetroot has beautiful red veins in the leaf. They're related, chard and beetroot, same family, similar leaf. And when they're baby leaves, they're very mild and soft. As they get bigger, the leaves get tougher. So the idea is that you would plant them closer together as if it was a cut and come again salad, and you crop it regularly before the leaves get big. So if you wanted chard or spinach to get to maturity and be big leaves, you would be planting them between 20 and 30 centimeters apart so that they can develop that into mature big leaves. But if you're doing it as cut and come again salad leaves, you can plant them much closer together. Now, kale we always think of as a sort of winter staple brassica crop. I'm still harvesting kale now every week, but we could be sowing kale now to be harvesting as baby leaves early on. Now, it won't develop well into a big plant at this time of year because it starts growing into the hotter season and then it will bolt. So if we want a big kale plant for big winter vegetables, we sow it much later in the summer and then plant it a good distance apart so it's got room to develop. But what we're doing now is planting kale as a salad leaf. So all of those we could sow directly into the soil, but and it germinates at 4 degrees. I personally find here in Wales, the soil is very wet and cold at this time of year, and I have heavy clay, so it stays very wet. So I find a better result is to sow them into modules in a greenhouse or polytunnel, and then I could be doing that now. They take a week or so to germinate, and then you know, a week or so to grow on, and then they're ready to plant out, either in a polytunnel or directly outside. And same as I said with the peas, you could be warming the soil up now by covering it so it starts to dry out and warm up if you're planting it directly out, if you're going to plant it outside. And you can cover it, you could put cloches over it, you can make your own hoops by cutting up fencing wire and making hoops, or using alkathene pipe and then covering that with plastic. The advantage of plastic cover is it actually keeps the rain out, and so the soil will warm up quicker because the soil is drier, but the soil will still get enough moisture from either side of the cloche hoops because it's winter and the soil is very wet. The other cover you can use is fleece, and garden fleece is very cheap and affordable, but and it's great for keeping the frost off. It will rise the temperature by about 2 to 3 degrees, depending on the quality of the fleece you buy. You can put a double layer on to increase the temperature as well. But I find with the salad leaves, using fleece as a floating mulch actually just holds the moisture onto the leaves. And then, of course, if it freezes, then it's a right mess. And it attracts more slugs underneath. So I wouldn't recommend a floating fleece mulch on your salad leaves. But cloche hoops, good, or any cloche. If it's a thin plastic layer like the polytunnel, that will raise the temperature by 3 degrees. If it's thicker like polycarbonate plastic, it will raise the temperature by about 4 degrees. If it's a glass cloche or greenhouse, you're looking at maybe 5 degrees temperature rise. So you can see the advantage of different protections there. Okay, so I think that's salad. Oh, and the other thing I'll say with salad leaves, cut and come again salad. Once they've germinated, you're only looking at about 6 weeks till harvest. So it's really not long at all. So if you get them sown now, you could be cropping them at the end of March. And the weather will be nice then, and you'll be starting to think of nice sunny summer weather. So it'll be perfect for having some salad then. So I'm now going to come on to carrots and beetroot. Again, these are hardy crops, but they will benefit from some protection. The carrots, you want to grow a hardy early variety like Nonce, Nontu. And your carrot crop, you never put muck on your carrot crop because it will make the carrots fork, which then makes them hard to wash and all the rest of it. So you want your carrots to be planted in a bed that was mucked last year, and it's just using up any nutrients that are left from that. If you've got heavy clay soil, then you might want to add a bit of sand into your carrot bed, and that will benefit your carrots, makes it easier for them to be harvested. They'll just pull out the soil eventually. And it will benefit the crops that follow on from that. So in your rotation, if you have a 4-year rotation, you'd just be putting sand in one bed every year, but it'd be a different bed each year. So year on year, your soil gets lighter and freer draining, and then that will lead to it warming up quicker. Carrots are always direct sown. Now, you do see in nursery centres them selling carrots in modules for you to transplant, but it's very hard to transplant them without disturbing the roots. So it's much, much better to direct sow them. And when you sow them really sparingly. They're very small seeds, and carrots are very prone to carrot root fly, which is attracted by the smell. So if they're oversown and they're too thick, you then have to thin them out. Well, you always have to thin them out because you can never sow them thinly enough. And you do this several times, and each time you thin them out, the smell of carrots is being wafted about, and that attracts carrot root fly. But the advantage of sowing your carrots early is the carrot root fly is not around until about April or the end of April. It comes about the same time as the cow parsleys in flower in the hedgerows. So you could be sowing your carrots now, you've thinned them out 2 or 3 times, and that's all done and out of the way before the carrot root fly is anywhere around, and that avoids that pest then. So if you're sowing early carrots, you can actually get a crop of carrots within 9 weeks. But these are baby carrots that you harvest and you eat young and fresh. Whereas your main crop carrots, you'll be sowing a bigger variety, and you can harvest them and they would keep. But these, when they're harvested young like this, they're eaten fresh. And then 9 weeks time, you harvest the crop, you clear the bed, and you can get another crop in that same bed this year. Then beetroot. So you can sow beetroot regularly, like the salad leaves. You can just keep sowing it, and the carrots, keep sowing it all season, every few weeks, get some more in and keep harvesting them regularly. Beetroot are quite a hungry crop, so they really do benefit from having some good compost, either dug in the soil or used as a mulch. And again, you need to thin your beetroots out, otherwise they don't get very big. And ultimately you want to thin them to about 10 centimeters. You can sow, beetroot aren't very deep rooted, so you can sow them in modules, and some people are sowing clusters of beetroot, maybe 3 in a module, and then just planting them out like that in a cluster. I've never done that, like I've never sown them like that, but I do know people that do and have good success with that. And the idea is then that you harvest a bunch of beetroot, and you'll be harvesting 3 or so at the time, but you do need to make sure you plant your modules far enough apart to develop. And it's always best to harvest your beetroot young. When you buy them in the shop, you see them and they're huge, great big things. But the bigger they get, the tougher they get. Whereas the young golf ball size ones are much sweeter and more tender. Well, I think they're just generally tastier. And you can get them in 7 to 12 weeks. And again, you can then clear the bed and get another crop in that same space in the same year. So you're maximizing your growing area. So we now come on to the tender crops to start early. Things like sweet peppers, chili, tomato, and basil. What I haven't added into this group is cucumbers and squashes. Now, cucumbers and squashes hate being cold, and they hate cold drafts. And cucumber seeds can be very expensive. You could be paying £1 a seed. So you don't want to lose them. So don't even consider sowing any cucumbers yet. I don't sow mine until much, much later, end of April, May for those. And in fact, I don't even sow any of these in February. Maybe like the very end of February, I might start thinking about sowing some tomatoes, because you have got to grow them and then keep growing them until the frost is finished. So they need warmth and light, and they need 18 to 21 degrees to germinate. So think about it. Is your house a constant 18 to 21 degrees? I know mine isn't. So if I want them to germinate, I would need to use a heated propagator. Now I'll look at those in the next slide. Once they have germinated, you need to pot them on, and you want to get them to a 9 centimeter pot, and that's the size pot that you usually see a tomato or pepper plant sold in, so 9 centimeter. And then you really don't want them in any bigger than a 9 centimetre pot at the point when you're going to be planting them out, because where are you going to keep all of those 9 centimetre pots? So when you're sowing your seeds merrily in the seed tray and you've suddenly sown a whole packet of sweet peppers rather, when they come to pot them on, prick them out and pot them on, and they're all in 9 centimetre pots, that takes up a lot of space. So even though I start mine late, I do grow a lot of tomatoes and peppers, and it gets to the point that where every surface of my house is full and the kitchen table is full of plants, and I'm just waiting for it to warm up enough so that I can move them to the greenhouse. So consider how much space they're going to take up later on down the line. And eventually, if you're going to grow them in pot, they will need a pot that's at least 30 centimetres. That's a foot wide. But they're hungry plants, they're thirsty plants, and they do grow much better the more space you can give them. So if you can plant them in the ground in a polytunnel greenhouse, that is better. So if you have started them early, even if it's in March, the sunlight is still low in the sky, the daylight hours are very short, and the plants will stretch to reach the sunlight. So you need to turn the pots every day so that they grow evenly and straight up and don't become elongated towards the sun. So once they've germinated, they need a constant minimum temperature of 10 degrees to stay alive. If the temperature drops below that, they stop growing. And once they've stopped growing, they've got to kickstart themselves back into growth when the temperature warms up again. And if that is a drafty space, then you can lose them altogether. They just get chilled. And the tempting thing with these young seedlings is to put them on the windowsill so they get maximum sunlight. But of course, on the windowsill, it's drafty. And when you shut the curtains at night, they're shut between the window and the curtains in this cold, drafty space. So if you do put them on the windowsill, you really need to take them off the windowsill at night so they're not getting chilled. And the other thing with putting them on the windowsill is when it's hot on the sunny days that are going to come any day soon, they can get scorched and dry out very quickly when they're in these small trays and modules. So you need to think about that. So what we really want to be doing is going back to when is the last frost, and then count back the weeks. So you want to be starting these seeds 6 to 8 weeks before the last frost. Now, if you're not going to put them outside, if they're going to be in a greenhouse, the greenhouse is going to be 4 or 5 degrees warmer than the outside. And you can always use a fleece inside the greenhouse to raise the temperature even more. So you actually, it doesn't need to be, you can protect the temperature in the greenhouse. But like I said, ideally you want a minimum temperature of 10 degrees. So even if they're in the greenhouse, the outside temperature really needs to be a minimum of 6 degrees at night so that your tomatoes still look healthy. And you'll find that if the temperature is too cold, your plants will start becoming nutrient deficient and going purple and not looking very healthy at all. And it's very tempting. Like last year, we had lots of hot weather. We had 3 months of drought. But the problem with hot weather when you live in the mountains is it can be really hot at day and then very cold at night. And last year, I lost over 100 tomato plants because this temperature suddenly dropped right down to -5 when we'd had daytime temperatures of over 20. And I'd just planted 50 plants out in the polytunnel. They were covered with fleece and I lost the lot. That was my early crops. And in the greenhouse, all the plants that are around the outside, around the glass, they all were lost. The ones in the middle of the greenhouse were kept warmer. So you do have to be careful with that. So the main problems of sowing these tender plants early is not having enough light. And you think of the days that we've got at the moment, many of them are just cloudy grey days without any sunlight at all. So the plants will really struggle to get enough light. And what happens is they become etiolated. The shoots grow long to reach the sunlight, and they, like these seedlings in the module tray at the top, they grow long and then they start flopping over because they haven't got the strength to hold themselves upright. Whereas what we really want is strong, sturdy stems with short internodal length. Now this picture is seedling plants. These are just the cotyledons, the seed leaves that you can see. But when they start growing true leaves, we want the gaps between the true leaves to be short and the stems to be thick. And that gives us a very strong plant, which will produce lots of trusses of fruit. Now, if we land up with plants that look like this top picture, when we come to prick them out and pot them on, we can actually plant them very deep in the pot and cover a lot of the stem so that the seed leaves are near the surface of the soil. But we then do need to give them enough sunlight. The other main problem is damping off disease, and this is a fungal disease, and it's mainly caused by overcrowding. And like I said before, if you're sowing into seed trays, it's very easy to oversow. You have a packet of seeds, and before you know it, the whole seeds all the seeds are in the seed tray in an instant. But a lot of these packets of seeds will have 400 seeds in them. So you have to think, do I want 400 plants? What am I going to do with them? And it's very hard to throw your seedlings away because you actually only wanted 10 plants. So take a small pinch of seeds out of the packet. You can even count the seeds to give you an idea of how many you've got. And once you've counted seeds of different sizes, you'll know roughly from year to year how many seeds are in a pinch. So it's something I always get my students to do before the growing season, is just to count a pinch of seeds, so they've got a rough idea how far that should go. And it's very good to do it with carrot seeds particularly, because carrot seeds are very small and it's very easy to oversow them. But one pinch of seed could have 50 to 70 seeds in it. You're not going to want that many pepper plants or tomato plants, so sow them thinly. If they are overcrowded, like in this picture, they quickly will get damping off disease. And what happens is suddenly a whole patch of them will just wilt and fall over. And if you look at the picture on the right at the bottom, what happens is the stem just sort of shrinks, and then it can't take up any moisture and nutrients, and that's it, it's gone. And because this is a fungal disease that's carried in water, it quickly spreads through the whole of the seed trays. From one plant to another. So watering. So to avoid damping off, you want to avoid watering your plants overhead and in the evening. Obviously, temperature is going to drop in the evening. So if you're watering in the evening, you're then getting cold, wet soil hanging around the plants. So it's better to water first thing in the morning. It uses the water during the heat of the day, and then the soil is drier overnight, so it doesn't get so cold. Overhead watering also gets water on the leaves, and then that is more likely to lead to mildews and damping off. And the slugs love it. So the slugs come out at night when we're not around and it's cool and wet. And if the compost is wet and the plants are wet, they're going to get munched by slugs. So water in the morning, keep it dry at night. You want to avoid the plants actually sitting in water. And a lot of people put their plants on trays and then water the trays. And that's fine. That's a really good way of doing it. But if that tray is constantly full of water, then there's no air pockets in the soil. And so the roots will rot, they can't grow, and it will spread disease. So watering into a tray is fine, but you water enough so that it drinks it that day and then it dries up. So in between watering, you want the surface of the soil to dry and you want any trays underneath to be dry. So a good way of monitoring that is use capillary matting, and that's shown in the picture at the top there. You can also use toweling, and you can have the edge of the capillary matting into a bucket of water, and the capillary matting sucks the water up through capillary action and takes it underneath the plant pot, and then it's absorbed through the soil to the plant as the plant needs it. It's very good if you're having to go out to work, which many of us don't have to at the moment and have the advantage of being at home and tending to our plants all the time. But if you're having to leave the house and go out, and then it can be quite sunny at the end of February and March, and they'll dry out very quickly in small modules and seed trays. So having the capillary matting underneath allows that constant access to water, but without them sitting in a bucket of water that can spread diseases. The other thing to consider is if your time is precious, or you're having to go out and leave them unattended, or perhaps you want to go on holiday occasionally, automated systems are very affordable now. So you can buy a timer. You can buy very expensive timers, but you can buy a timer for about £15 that runs on a little battery, and you can have that on a mains, or you can have it attached to a water butt, and you set the timer. When it comes on, the water flows through the timer and will water your plant, and you just set the timer to come on once a day, once a week, for 5 minutes, for 15 minutes, whatever you need. They're quite good systems to look at if your time is precious. So speeding things up. So we know that those tender plants need temperatures of above 18 degrees. Now we can achieve that quite simply by covering our pots up. We can just put a plastic bag over the pot, or we could buy one of these little plastic propagators. There's the one at the top there is a windowsill one, so it's got a nice big tray underneath that you can put water in. It's got individual little seed trays so that you're not sowing too many seeds of one variety, and they've got little plastic lids on the top with air vents in, which you can open and shut. So they're a very good way of just raising the temperature a bit and keeping the seedlings free from draft. But the water will evaporate from the soil, especially if they're in a sunny site, and then the plastic gets covered in dripping water. So you need to open the air vent occasionally and remember to shut it before the evening, before the night, or just take the lids off for a little while and then put them back on. So that's the simplest version, plastic bag, or buy one of these little unheated cloches. But if you really want to speed things up, you can buy propagators with heat underneath. So again, like these little windowsill ones, you can get heated propagators like this, and they don't cost a lot. But they give you a constant temperature, and that speeds up the respiration rate, which is cell division, and so the germination will happen quicker and will be guaranteed because you've got the temperature you need. But once the seedlings have germinated and you've got the root growing down and the shoot growing up, you need to take it off that heat, because it's not natural for a seedling to have 18 degrees at the bottom of the soil. And so if you leave it on that bottom heat, it will actually stop the roots from growing down, and it will stunt the growth of the plant. And so that's the difficult thing. If you're using a heated propagator, you then have to have somewhere to move them onto, so they come out of the heat and the lovely protected area, and you don't want to then just stick them on the windowsill where they're going to get a cold draft. So you would need to be covering them so they're out of draft and have an intermediate space between the heat and just being in the open air. So these pictures show different versions of bottom heat. You can create yourself if you don't want to go out and buy one of these heated propagators, or if you want to make something a bit bigger. So you can just make a frame, you can put some sand in it or some vermiculite, and then you can buy a heated cable, and you can zigzag the heated cable in the sand, and then you cover the whole thing up with some plastic or some old windows or something if you want a glass lid, and that can give you a much bigger heated propagating space if you've got space for that. So we've managed to get our seeds to germinate. We've raised the temperature so you're going to get more successful germination. But when they have germinated and they start producing true leaves, we then need to make sure they've got enough sunlight. And that is the downside of these early sowings. There really isn't enough sunlight at this time of year. So you then might need to think about artificial light, but then it starts getting expensive, and space and where you're going to put it. And this is why those tender seedlings, I tend to delay the planting until March. Once we get to March the 21st, day and night are the same length. We have the spring equinox. So if we start germinating things a couple of weeks before the spring equinox, by the time they've germinated and they're out the soil and they've got true leaves, we've then got a good amount of 12 hours of daylight. And so you're going to get much more success rate with your tender crops. You're less likely to get elongated, long, weak stems. So I prefer delaying the sowing of these until we get into March. And of course, if you haven't got the space or the warmth to set this up, these tender plants all become available from the nursery and local growers at a later date. So just to recap, things that you could be sowing now that are hardy are broad beans, peas, and onions. They don't need any protection. You can just go ahead and plant them outside. Things that you can be growing that are hardy but will benefit from a little bit more protection would be all your leafy salad crops. So cut and come again, salads, spinach, chard, kale, brassica, leafy brassicas. You could be getting away with an early crop of beetroot and carrots. And if you've got all the if you've got protective growing and the space and the heat, you could be starting growing some peppers and tomatoes. So I've got some resources here. I've put up there the garden planner. This is an online digital planner. So for planning your crop rotation. So for those of you who are on last week's talk, you might find that useful. Well, any of you will find that useful. I think it's a free starter. But that's long enough to do your plan, and then you can print it out. So that's quite good. Elliot Coleman, he's a renowned grower, very successful, getting the most out of your space. He's got a winter harvest handbook, and then there's Dr. Hessian books, which I mentioned last week. They are terrible for using pesticides and weed killers and stuff, but as a quick reference book, can you all see that? There's a whole range. This one's the vegetable one. There's a whole range of different ones, and they're very, very good quick reference. Hang on, let me show you. So every vegetable's in there, and I don't know how well you can see that, but it's got how to sow it. It's got some varieties, how many seeds in a packet, and germination times and times to harvest. So I find it a very good quick reference book, either when I'm in the field and wanting to know planting distances, or when I'm doing my crop planner and want to know how long is it going to take before I can harvest that crop and get the next one in. So that's a few different resources that you might find helpful. I think that's it. We've got time for some questions. I didn't really introduce myself at the beginning. Sorry about that. So I'll do it at the end. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Emma Maxwell. We have a market garden just outside Llanidloes called Ash and Elm Horticulture. We're at Old Hall. My website's there. You can always contact me through the website. And we've got an online shop as well. We grow 5 acres of veg, fruit and flowers. And I teach for Aberystwyth University, and I teach for Mach doing a train growers to be commercial growers. So we've got a new program of that starting in September, if anyone wants to be a commercial grower. So we've got time now for questions. I'll have a stop this and see what's in the chat.
I've got the first one here, Emma. Thanks for that, by the way. It's brilliant. I've got one about onions saying, if you sow onion seeds now, should you keep them indoors or outside?
Well, they're hardy, so either. But if you've got room to have them inside, you know, they're going to grow better for being protected, but they'll do perfectly fine outside as well.
Amazing. And then one from J9. What is your take on seed tapes?
Seed tapes are great for anyone who is visually impaired or has trouble with their hands. You know, if you've got arthritis or something in your joints, seed tapes are great, but they're very expensive. You know, so to use them on a regular basis, if you don't need to, is probably a very expensive option. So for anyone who doesn't know, a seed tape is your seeds are already placed at the right distance on a piece of biodegradable tape. So you literally open the packet, roll out the tape. You get sheets as well. You can buy sheets of them or strips of them, and you then just lay them out on the bed and they'll germinate once they get wet. So yeah, very good for, like I say, older people that have lost the mobility in their hands.
Shall I keep on, or do you want to?
Yeah, go ahead. It's better if you read them.
Okay. Yeah. From Colette, she was asking whether gherkins are the same as cucumbers when it comes to starting them and what time you should do it.
Yeah, I think gherkins are probably slightly hardier than cucumbers. The supermarket cucumber is really a greenhouse cucumber. You wouldn't grow that in outdoors. So if you want those long straight cucumbers, they really need protection. They like that high temperature and no drafts, whereas gherkins tend to be more of an outdoor ridge cucumber, and so they will suffer a little bit colder environments. But again, still, I wouldn't start them for at least a month or so.
Great. And she also had another question about her strawberries that she grew from runners last year, and has read that she shouldn't let them flower fruit in their first year. And is this true?
Yes, it is true if you're planting them now, but if you planted them in the autumn, they've had the whole winter to establish their roots and settle into their new growing space, and they will probably be fine flowering and fruiting in the first year. But if you're planting them now, they won't have developed the plant strong enough to flower. So if you let it flower and fruit in the first year, it's not going to be, it'll be doing that to the detriment of producing a good plant for the long term. So although it's very, very hard to do, you are supposed to take the flowers off.
Yeah, that is hard, isn't it? One from Sarah. He's wondering, it sounds like in a previous experience of beetroots. She says, what would eat whole beetroots into cores whilst they are in the soil?
Mice. Yes, they love them. Mice are the hardest. I think they're the most challenging thing for growers. And, you know, they often just take 1 or 2 bites out of things and then go on. So every beetroot will have a mouthful out of it, and every strawberry has 1 mouthful missing. They don't eat the whole thing.
Yeah, they are. Yeah. Broad beans. Oh, my broad beans got eaten last year. by mice, I think, or rats or something.
Yeah, so get more cats.
From Victoria, who living in Scotland, she said, if we're in a colder climate such as Scotland, is it best to keep cut and come again covered for longer?
You really have to just go with what the weather's doing with you, because there's little pockets of different weather wherever you are. So, and I mean, the salad, cut and come again salad, I've sown it outside in February in this time of year, and it's done absolutely fine in Newtown. But I wouldn't really do it at mine, and I'm only 15 miles away, just because I'm higher up and it's colder and windier, so they're more likely to get damaged by the wind. I'd be more worried about the wind shredding the leaves than I would be the cold and the snow. So you just have to, know your climate. And if you don't know your climate, I always say to growers, just try things out. So put some inside and put some outside and see what happens, because that's the best way you're going to learn, is just try it out. And for the price of a few seeds, give it a go. You're not losing much. But like I say, if you are covering it, you do have to be careful. I'm not a great lover of covering things, because once they're covered, you're not keeping an eye on them. And at this time of year, everything's very wet, so there's a lot of slugs out there. And so as soon as you start covering salads, you're going to get a lot of slugs in there.
Makes sense. There's another one from Janine, and she says, I would like to try to grow sweet corn in Mach this year. What sort of time frame would you recommend for sowing and planting?
Okay, well, sweet corn, you need to get a modern variety that has a short growing season. So you could look at Real Seeds, see what they've got, what they're recommending for the Welsh climate, or an F1 variety that's been bred to grow in our climate. Shorter season is good, because Machynlleth, you're much milder than me. Your frosts are further apart, you've got longer growing season. But they do like hot temperatures. So I would start them maybe April, and in pots, and then plant them out after the last frost. And you have to plant your sweet corn in blocks, because they're wind pollinated. So you need to be planting a minimum of 9 plants in a block, 3 by 3, so that the wind will pollinate all of them. Otherwise you won't get any crop.
Great. And I think, unless I've missed any questions, then that is all of the questions so far. If anyone has any more, we've got a little bit more time for any more questions if people do have them. And if I have missed anyone, just pipe up, unmute yourself and pipe up. And if there isn't any more questions, it's just really nice seeing where people were from, and I'm quite surprised actually. I was just expecting most people just to be from the valley, and quite a few people like from all over the place. And I was just a bit curious how people found out about this event. It sort of helps us know how to promote it and things. So I don't know if you could just, is it mostly the Facebook that people found out about it? Just curious anyway. If people want to pop it in the chat or say it out loud, or I don't know. But yeah, thank you.
No, I suppose everyone knows someone in Mach perhaps, and has got connections there.
Yeah, it's really not. I mean, I suppose it's the benefit of the online thing, is that suddenly you can people can connect from all over the place.
We've got a question there. Do we have a problem with raccoons? No, we don't. We don't have raccoons. My biggest problem is pheasants. After the mice, of course.
Yeah, right, pheasants. Yeah, well, that was so interesting. Thank you so much, Emma. It's really inspired me anyway to be dust off those seed packets from last year and get going. But
one thing I will say to you all about seed packets is, I said they keep really well. It's a mistake a lot of people make with seed packets is they store them in their greenhouse or conservatory because that's where you're using them. But if they get too hot and dry, they lose their viability. Because although seeds are dry, they still contain 5 to 10% moisture. And when they get hot, they dry out and then they don't become, they lose their viability. So you should keep your seeds in a closed container, like an airtight container, like a Tupperware or something like that. And they always say about keeping them in the fridge to keep them cold. Most of us don't have room in the fridge for seed packets, but don't keep them in your greenhouse or somewhere warm. Keep them somewhere cool, basically, and then they'll last for years.
Brilliant. And if you have enjoyed this and you feel inspired to support either Edible Mach or Plan Avoid, you can find our websites online, and you can donate or you can become a supporter of Edible Mach as well, which is always much appreciated. We are in the process of trying to get funding to keep these sorts of things running, but yeah, so fingers crossed for all of that. But yeah, donations are always greatly received.
Helen's just put the Mathalon website in the link chat box there, so people can go there.
Helen, who is another coordinator for Edible Mach, is just going to pop on now and just say about some other upcoming workshops that we've got planned.
Hi, I'm really in the dark. Yeah, we've got lots more workshops coming up. We've got a couple of cooking workshops and also some more growing ones. We've got a tool sharpening workshop coming up, and also a session about mushroom cultivation. So keep an eye on the Facebook page and our website, and the details will be on there.
Great. Thanks, Helen. And thanks, Emma. I think that's it if there's no more questions. And thank you everyone for coming, and thanks, Emma, for sharing all that wisdom and gardening info.
Thanks for having me again.
And good luck everyone getting those seeds in the ground.
Yeah, happy growing. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.